Now, as we move on, we will have our next speaker from the European Training Foundation, Ms. Pirita Vuorinen, and she will join us online. So now I would like to thank you for your patience a little bit. We just need to make a minor technical adjustment. Just a moment.
So good afternoon. Thank you to the Hungarian presidency and the National Research, Development and Innovation Office for inviting the European Trading Foundation to be with you today. Thank you also for being so accommodating as to make this session possible online in a very hybrid modus. I do apologize again for this last minute change and for not being able to be with you there in person. I was very much looking forward to it. The last time I was in Budapest when I was 15 years old, and that's a long time ago. First, a couple of words about the European Training Foundation. The ETF is an agency of the EU, and we're based in Torino, Italy. The role of the ETF is to support the European neighborhood countries in improving their human capital development. Mostly we focus on vocational education and training and labor market policies in the context of EU's external relations policy. And my name is Pirita Vuorinen, and I lead the team of ETF experts that look at skills specifically from a company standpoint and growth and competitiveness standpoint. I can go on if you just let me know when the presentation is up. I can't hear you at all. Now it's coming. Thank you. So you can move to the next slide, please.
Yes, just a moment.
So while you do that, I'll just continue talking so that we manage to move forward. So thank you for John Edwards for saying so many things about the role of vocational education and training and its importance. When I first started taking part in the Smart Specialization discussion in 2015, the role of human capital in Smart Specialization was really seen limited to higher education and research. So despite the fact that investment in human capital in a broader sense had been recognized as an important catalyst for economic growth and development, the discussion around skills in Smart Specialization was really very limited. Since then, progressively, once economies, and again, we work in the neighborhood region, once the economy started going through the entrepreneurial discovery process and companies themselves brought up the issue on skills gaps and labor shortages, the perception on the role skills and human capital play in Smart Specialization has progressively been changing, and this event is a big testament to that. In developing the ETF methodology, or the approach as I like to call it, to skills for Smart Specialization, we have built on the economic priorities identified by the Joint Research Center, who will lead on the Smart Specialization, to then anchor the Smart Specialization strategy in a realistic supply of relevant skills, to have basically suitable trained workforce for higher productivity and potential of innovation. So that's largely where we base ourselves up on. If you manage to now move the slides, you could skip to the next slide. There we go. So the ETF first started more formally exploring what Smart Specialization means for skills actually in 2018. Over the years, we've developed what we call a mix of methodologies, tools, and approaches that are helpful to us in helping economies understand how human capital impacts Smart Specialization and vice versa, because both are true. Here you can essentially see what we look at. We look at the skills demand, both current and future. We'll look at the different trends that are shaping the demand for skills, occupations, and qualifications. We look at the training offer, both initial and continuing vet, but also very importantly, business support services to companies. Just like John Edwards says, the concept of VET is kind of fluid, and it's often not understood that business support services are very much a part and parcel of the VET system. We then look at the capacity of training providers to meet the current and future demand in terms of training content, the relevance of the training content, quality of the training content, and very importantly, access to training. Finally, we look at the relatedness of skills. What this means is that we try to identify the inter-industry labor flows within which people change jobs. This was already mentioned in the opening remarks to an extent. So these job switches generally take place within industries that are similar in terms of human capital requirements. People don't usually move outside those parameters. So understanding skills relatedness is really very important for recognizing and leveraging the transferable skills that professionals already possess within those related industries. This has emerged as a critical issue, for instance, in the solar and wind energy sectors. Both are struggling in Europe with skill shortages. At the same time, coal workers, for instance, possess similar skill sets in terms of technology, and they can be retrained, basically bypassing a 2-year VET course by only attending on-the-job training or short trainings, and they can be qualified to work in the solar and wind energy. This significantly shortens the time that workers need for basically it shortens the times that workers need to transition between sectors. And for the EU, this is a very critical issue, especially in order to meet the energy targets that Europe has set for itself. But we have to admit that the skills relatedness has been a rather challenging issue for us to analyze. We can look at the way industries are linked through technology, but we have not been really able to look at how industries are linked through skills as much. The reason for that is that as we work in the neighborhood countries, and this methodology or approach has been implemented in 8 candidate countries, these countries basically do not have the pension fund data that we would need in order to track those job switches between the different related sectors. So that's why this is definitely a limitation for us, but we hope to be able to work on that in the near future. You can move to the next slide, please. Okay, so before we talk about the methodology per se, I think it's really important to highlight the key stakeholders. This was also mentioned earlier by our colleagues also from Spain. There's a need for permanent dialogue, but there are also policy cycles, policy changes, people change, but the issues remain. So one way of anchoring change and making it, trying to sustain it over these policy cycles and changes in government is to actually anchor the process in a broader range of stakeholders that have an ownership over the issue and can drive the process forward despite these changes. That's why we use sometimes for our project the slogan, working together is something, working together is everything. So who are the key stakeholders? Well, first of all, for us, it's companies. This was something that we had a lot of questions. How will you be able to engage companies? Especially since about 99% of the companies in countries where we work are micro and very small companies. Do they have a vested interest? It's much easier to work with large companies, but those are not the domestic employers. We wanted to work with domestic employers, so we want to work with micro and small companies. They are the key stakeholders for our project. Their skills needs is our starting point. Other key stakeholders for our project, obviously the vocational education and training providers, so the VET providers, higher education, research institutions, business support organizations, so these can be clusters, chambers, associations, civil society organizations, anything, basically. Policymakers, by policymakers we refer primarily to the Smart Specialization Working Group, so this is an advantage of starting from an economic priority like Smart Specialization. Certain mechanisms are already in place. As well as EU peer learning partners. This is a very important category for us that maybe stands out of the ordinary, but we basically identify the relevant peer learning partners for stakeholders from EU member states so that they can represent the same stakeholder groups that you see here on your screen. And we match from our economies the stakeholders with their peers from EU institutions with similar priorities. So we essentially go on a manhunt online to find the right people. Some people call that cyber stalking. For us, it's stakeholder mapping. We identify the right people because when you put right people together, you can start the wheels that then drive change over a longer period of time that bypasses also the changes in government. You can move to the next slide. Oh, one quick thing on this slide before we go to this one. You see here the advisory board. What is the role of the advisory board? Why do we have it? Well, when we work cross-country, and we find it very useful to have an advisory board, which is essentially a policy level function, which brings together the key national authorities, so the key people from the smart specialization teams in every country. It brings together the European Union delegations in the countries, as well as the relevant Directorate Generals of the European Commission. So this kind of policy advisory body is very important for us to feed the findings to policy level so that we can connect the dots with the different other strategies that are going on and where skills play a role. Now we can skip to the next slide so we see a bit more from a practical standpoint, what does the stakeholder engagement mean for us? So here you see on your screens an extract of the type of stakeholders that we mobilized in our Western Balkan agri-food project. So all of the Western Balkan economies, the 6 economies, have identified agri-food as a priority domain for smart specialization. And so that's why we're working regionally in the Western Balkans in agri-food. So here, basically, is what you see is the stakeholders we mobilized in the first few months of the project in 2022. It's quite a number of stakeholders considering that the size of our team. So we went on a big kind of mapping exercise and contacting stakeholders in order to find the right stakeholders. All together, now that we're 3 years into the project, a little bit under, we've basically been somehow in collaboration with about 900 different stakeholders from the Western Balkans and the EU, peer learning partners. However, we actively, already just for budget reasons, work with around 100 stakeholders. Just 2 weeks ago, we had 90 participants in a networking event from 15 countries in Serbia at a region to talk about agri-food, agri-tech specifically, and organic food production. You can move to the next slide. So to summarize what we do, this is a very oversimplification, but sometimes that helps. As ETF, we focus on analyzing skills, demand, and supply, and on building a vision for smart specialization. However, it's very, very important to state that what we do is not driven by research. Research is a means. We're very much process-driven. And by this, I mean that we don't just produce research, but we use the research as a tool to generate what we are really after. And that's generating joined-up action among stakeholders to develop solutions and take action to address the identified skills. So we want to move within one project from research to implementation. And this is really where the EU peer learning partners play a really critical role. They're carefully identified by our team and matched with our stakeholders. You can move to the next slide, please. I'll unpack 2 of the different types of analysis that we do to give you an idea. There's many more things that we do, but I'll just unpack briefly 2. The first step in our analysis is a more traditional one. It consists of quantitative and qualitative analysis, and it involves interviews with the stakeholders. So this is where all the stakeholders we've identified get to play a role. We also conduct job portal searches and other searches to support our analysis. Often, actually, the most complex step in this analysis is defining the scope of what we're analyzing. we always base ourselves on the companies in the smart specialization domain that have been selected to take part in the project. So while the activities of the companies generally fall into niche markets that don't necessarily reflect the NACE categories, we need still to focus on the broader NACE categories. Otherwise, we basically don't have any data to work with. Once we have identified the relevant NACE categories, we then look into what are the technology trends in EU member states and the impact on prominent occupational profiles according to the EU according to the ESCO classification, basically. So we look at occupational profiles in the EU according to the ESCO classification. We then use the data on technology trends in the EU as a proxy for the countries we're working, for instance, in Western Balkans, to then explore the potential impact on prominent occupational profiles. So how are technologies shaping the occupational profiles and the skills in the economies where we work? Again, our aim is not to produce studies for the sake of it, but to use the studies that we produce to develop solutions before we even have time to publish the report. So we want to have a very short cycle between the research and implementation of the recommendations. This is why we put a lot of emphasis on networking events, where we discuss the findings of the different reports, and we adjust the findings in the reports. And we use these networking ideas to really create that connection between the EU peer learning partners and our project stakeholders, for instance, in the Western Balkan economies. The networking events are really, and the different workshops within those networking events are designed to facilitate discussion and identify the potential for joint action. Generally, we facilitate also understanding of the different EU financial instruments that are available to seek funding for, and so such as like Erasmus and Horizon. But we also use other opportunities. We talk about the IPA funding. There's also some bilateral fundings from EU member states and other opportunities. So it's a means to connect the joint action to also funding opportunities. One of the discussions we've had is there resources to take action? And the conclusion we've come to, there's always resources. You just need a good proposal and a group of people from different countries ready to drive it forward. Seems simple, but it's actually quite hard to find a committed group of people to really develop a joint concept and drive it forward. So that's where the EU peer learning partners that we partner our stakeholders with, we usually try to make sure that they have a track record in working with different EU financial instruments so that they can bring that expertise to also the candidate countries. But an important point to mention here that as an EU agency, the ETF role in these joint initiatives and undertakings is purely limited to the research findings and recommendations and connecting stakeholders. As an EU agency, we cannot play any part in project proposals under EU funding instruments. You can move to the next slide. This is where we get to the more interesting part, maybe from a methodological perspective, at the skills foresight. In skills foresight, we do not rely on actually the traditional qualitative and quantitative methods, but we together with our contractor, we've developed a combined methodology for skills foresight. We've basically added big data analysis. The methodology builds on the previous analysis that I just showed you on technology trends and skills needs, but in addition, it uses semantic matching algorithms to compare relevant technologies extracted from patent literature with occupational profiles in ESCO. So we are looking deeper into the future than in the previous analysis. The big data analysis allows us basically to identify factors shaping future demands, so some things that are not yet necessarily visible. And this allows us to then to anticipate the need for related skills, competencies, and occupations. So it's more of a predictive has more of a predictive power than the traditional approaches, I would say. The challenge, of course, in text mining and big data analysis is that a lot of the searches are limited to English in terms of language, and the non-technological innovations are less represented in the results, and that's a big chunk of the results. You can move to the next slide. This is basically just to give you a quick glimpse of what we get as a result of the big data analysis. The first part of the big data analysis in the skills foresight basically involves the processing the worldwide patent database to retrieve inventions related to the smart specialization domain in question. For instance, in the agri-food sector, which I used here, the examples from the Western Balkans, we see that there were peaks in inventive activity in 2017, and after this, the pace of innovations has stabilized. Still, there are about 140,000 inventions every year worldwide in the sector. So even though it has peaked, the innovation level remains high. And examining the different individual trends in the smart specialization domains then allows us to see the trends and how they could, if adopted, how these inventions could then shape the demand for skills and occupational profiles in the domain. What this implies is that if economies want to remain competitive in international markets, they need to ensure that they have their workforce has the right skills in order to be ready to adopt and use these technologies. So this has direct implications for the education and training systems broadly. We can also distinguish here the technology with significant inventive activity that is slowing down, so it's stabilizing. So maybe from a skills and competencies perspective, we may still need to be regularly updating, but there might not be any radical inventions. But we can also identify those more emerging technologies, which could become even game changers in the future, requiring entirely new qualifications, for instance, new skills. What we can see also from the patents, and you can see this on the right-hand side of your screen, we can see the economy's readiness to leverage new technologies. We do this by combining patent filings from companies with information about the existing use of technology. So the higher the number of the bubbles, the higher the readiness to leverage these technologies in the particular economy. Using patents to analyze skills implications of technology development, it's important still to remember that not all innovations are patented. So it's a tool to help discuss and move towards joint action, but by no means should be taken as a black and white document. There's many nuances, and many technologies can, for instance, be used in a country simply by importing them. They don't have to be developed in a country. So we have to be careful with the conclusions we draw from the analysis. You can move to the next slide. By then applying the text mining and ranking procedures in the skills foresight, the next step we do is correlate the new technologies with the required skills, and then we rank the skills. The ranking basically indicates which skills are and will be potentially significant in the domain based on the technological developments. Each bar in the chart represents the cumulative relevance levels of the various skills, but important, the ranking is not a quantitative measure, but a qualitative indicator of the increasing demand as a result of introducing new technologies. So what this means is that we're able to say how relatively important, for instance, solar technicians can be, so the relative importance, but we cannot yet answer the questions, how many solar technicians will be needed next year? That's a question we still cannot answer. You can move to the next slide. So by continuing to apply the text mining and ranking procedures, we can then rank the occupations based on their anticipated future demand. This gives a general idea of which occupations are likely to see an increase in the demand in the near future. And this ranking takes into account occupation skills matches and occupation technology matches. Then we can move to the next slide. More practical, what does this mean? Here you see essentially in 7 steps our Western Balkans project. Again, the research bus is a tool that connects us towards, helps us identify common issues, develop common solutions, and move towards joint projects, of which ETF is not part of, because we cannot. But really, the project is more process-driven. So here, basically, what you see is what I call the 7 steps to a network, is that we really move from identifying issues to meeting, discussing. Obviously, not all the steps are described here. These are the macro steps. There are countless meetings online and in person. And one of the benefits of working in this way over the last 3 years, I would say, is that at ETF, we cannot obviously stay engaged in something eternally. We have to have an exit at some point. And in this case, we were actually requested by a regional center of excellence to take over the project. So next year, we'll be working with the Biosense Institute, which is the leading institute on anything related to agri-food. And they're establishing a business support center, and they will continue to facilitate this network next year with us. And then ETF will assume a smaller role because we have other areas that we need to move into. But what I have seen in the last 3 years is that that by building the kind of the knowledge on skills, skills needs analysis, bringing stakeholders together over common objectives allows you to build over 3 years a network of about 900 stakeholders with various levels of engagement. And right now in 2025, not only is this kind of dialogue that we've developed going to continue at the regional level, but in fact, we're developing also national coordination mechanisms. This was at the request of the countries who are part of the network. John Edwards mentioned capacity of education training institutions. I think this is a really important topic. One of the issues that we've had, for instance, is that vocational education training institutions have a very limited capacity to be part of international cooperation. The institutional capacity is very low. And one thing that we have to do is build such networking in institutions that can carry such cooperation. And in the case of Western Balkans, it's more universities that can assume that role. That's basically from my side as a summary as I can in this time to present to you the approach. So it's methodologies and tools. I gave you examples of some of them. I did not address at all the technology transfer studies that we do or the business trainings, coachings that we do, but this was a snapshot, and thank you for your time. If you're interested, by the way, you can skip to the next slide. If you go on the ETF website, you go into the what we do, you will find skills for enterprise development. And then you can find, if you click on the right, you will find the Western Balkans project. There's a lot of research there. I think there's over 30 papers in total that we've produced over the 3 years. And you can find all the documents on these websites. Thank you.